So just to bring the viewers up to speed,
Yeah.
because I think that so one of the things we talked about when the recording was cut off is like, why are people interested in RPE and reps in reserve in the first place? And it relates back to what we were just talking about, where if you're making a percentage based program, if you say, I want people to be doing sets of 5 at 80%, what you have in mind is like, I want people to be doing reasonably hard but non-failure sets at 80%. But if someone has really good strength endurance, those sets of 5 might be really easy. If someone has piss poor strength endurance, it might be training to failure from set 1, and now the program's way too hard. And so, yeah, people are interested in RPE and RIR to try to normalize the stimulus so it's similar for everyone. But you're raising a very good point, which is, like, one, you need to know what those numbers are referring to. Like, if someone says that set was an RPE 9, I had 1 rep in reserve, the next question is how do you know that? And one of the things that I've noticed, just kind of observing lifters online, observing lifters in the gym, is I think that there's kind of a generational gap of the pre-RPE generation and the post-RPE generation. Because, I know that when I got into lifting, I just trained to failure a lot. And like I still do. It's fun. I like working hard. So like something like bicep curls.
Yeah.
I'm never gonna do bicep curls with 3 reps in reserve. Like I'm doing it to failure or past failure. But yeah, so if you already have a lot of experience with training to failure, if someone says, hey, do a set with 2 reps in reserve, you say, okay, cool, that's easy. I know what that feels like. But if like a younger lifter who came into the sport when RP reps in reserve were already very popular, then, maybe they don't have that much experience training to failure. And if you tell them, hey, do a set of squats with 3 reps left in reserve, and then you see the video and you just know as a coach, there were 8 reps in reserve. They need, like, they just don't know how many reps in reserve they have. And in research, we call that anchoring the scale. So if you're telling someone, hey, 0 reps in reserve, that's like one extreme end of the scale, 0 reps in reserve, 10 RPE. The way that you anchor that scale is actually get people to train to failure so that they then know what that feels like and can then work backwards and sort out what everything else feels like. And I think that with a lot of lifters, like RPE and reps in reserve work theoretically, but they don't work in practice because they've never adequately anchored that scale. And like you mentioned, it's also going to depend on the way you're doing reps. And ultimately, when you're writing programs, this comes down to, like, what is the purpose the coach had for writing the exercise they did and the particular training variables they did. So, if someone's doing bicep curls purely just for biceps hypertrophy, and they're, taking their time, squeezing everything, controlling the eccentric, 2 reps in reserve might feel very different than someone who I guess is like training for maximal biceps power and doing reps accordingly. So yeah, ultimately I think it's down to the coach to be clear to the lifter or the person buying their program, like, ultimately what is the purpose of this exercise, to like contextualize how they're supposed to feel and what they're supposed to be getting out of it.
Okay. That brings up the next question. So if we're staying on the strength field, not bodybuilding, but the lower exercises are going to be basically just there for hypertrophy, right? I mean, doing sets of 8 to 10 on, cross-body tricep extensions or something like that probably isn't going to have a whole lot of correspondence to pushing your bench up, except maybe the endurance aspect, the slight muscle endurance aspect, but it's for the triceps. So down in there, would it be would it be better, right, for the lifter to have that slower intent to where they don't use momentum to start it, keep it more controlled, flex for a second, use lighter, this is where I'm going here, use a lighter load, right, because it's going to be somewhat maybe better on the joints. I'm hesitant to say anything concretely, right, because there's so many nuances with that, but I would say it's easier on the joints because it's a lighter load. You're going to be able to get more range of motion, take the momentum out, or to just keep it heavy, right? Let's say for yourself, the difference between maybe using a 30-pound dumbbell, a 25-pound dumbbell, or using a 60-pound dumbbell, both for the sets of 6 to 8. You know, for that hypertrophy, one, you're going to go a little slower. Both, you're going to be in the same RIR. Which one would be best? And granted, it can be phasic, I get that. But which one would be best for the person that's looking for the hypertrophy?
Realistically, I don't think it matters all that much. Like, I think as long as the set's pretty hard, you're getting pretty close to failure. You know, if someone is using all of the momentum in the world for their bicep curls or whatever, like, ultimately, they're still going to fail because their biceps gave out. Like, that is going to be the link that fails. But I do think that from a practical perspective, what you're getting at has a lot of merit. I also wouldn't make any like really strong evidentiary claims that going slower using lighter weights is definitely safer and is definitely going to reduce injury risk. But like, I kind of think it will. And I'll note, I also used to make the, I would sometimes argue and push back against that because I thought that, you know, when you're really isolating a muscle, if you're like slightly more ballistic about it, that might put a little bit more tendon strain on you, which might be better for tendon adaptations. Like that sounds like a dangerous thing.
No,
Tendon strain, that's going to hurt you. As long as the load's manageable, like, you'll probably be fine. And just, you know, just like you need particular stimuli to make your muscles adapt, you need particular stimuli to make your tendons adapt as well. So I would sometimes previously argue that, like, maybe getting a little bit more crazy with it might actually be good sometimes, because that's going to give you more tendon strain, better for tendon adaptations, and make everything else you do a little bit safer. But there was actually a meta-analysis that just came out looking at the effect of different types of training on tendon adaptations. And it seems like load ultimately doesn't have much of an effect on how well tendons adapt. So, you know, that takes away that argument in favor of maybe going heavier and being slightly more ballistic with single joint training. So yeah, now I'm fully on board with, reduce the weight, control it, take your time, and do your single joint bodybuilding style training, like accessory work in that fashion.
So if you're doing it with, you know, more explosive intent from the beginning, like the heavier stuff we're talking about, does that have any change on the firing pattern, you know, of the muscle, right, of the firing? And B, if it does, is it even significant?
I mean, it probably does, but then the question is, like, to what extent does that matter? So if you really train your triceps to fire with optimal efficiency for a cross-body tricep extension, is that necessarily going to make them more efficient when they're firing for the bench press? Yeah. And I kind of don't think so.
No. Yeah. I get what you're saying. So the specificity of what's higher up in the chain, the reason for doing it in the first place. Yeah. So if it's just hypertrophy, forget all that, but just to grow the tricep, is that going to make any difference?
I don't think so, no.
Okay. And then staying on this, you know, RPE, RIR, all the other kind of stuff, where the reps, right, the variance in there, how am I going to try to ask this? Because we based it on the intensity, right? So is where we based it. There, now if it's effort, right? So now the effort, what you're talking about earlier, kind of the metabolic demands of all that. Is that, because in my brain, I kind of see that as two different scales. Are those two different scales, or is it kind of just one and the same, or is it only two different for me because I have all the experience? I know what it feels like to do the set and be on the floor after a set of 10.
Like, are you asking about, like, the general correspondence between, like...
Well, just the effort, right? So going to the old meathead adage, right? Like, you're not training hard, where it's like, okay, what's that even mean? You know,
I do think they're getting at slightly different concepts.
Yes.
You know, if you're training in kind of a Zen state, like you're one of those low intensity type lifters, not intensity in terms of weight on the bar, but like you're just not a super intense person in the gym. You know, then you could legitimately do a set, legitimately stop it when you have 2 reps in reserve, but then crank the music up to 11, hit an ammonia cap, get kind of crazy with it, and then do that exact same set, but have 4 reps in reserve if you stopped like at the exact same number of reps, like because you were in a real sense like putting more effort into the set. So yeah, I do think that like RPE will certainly scale with effort. Like a all else being equal, a higher RPE, lower RIR set is going to be a set that requires more effort. But if all else isn't equal and your overall approach to that set differs, you know, you could have the same RPE but like very different levels of effort in a set and very different levels of performance.
Is it? I guess what I'm trying to get at is, let's say on one training day, you know, I'm doing, say 1 week I do that exercise, the next week I do the same exercise. So the first week I'm batshit crazy when I do that exercise, and it's at RPE 8. That second week I do the same thing, but not batshit crazy. It's still the RPE 8. Are the recovery demands the same?
I think they're probably not, but it's hard to say for sure.
Okay.
Yeah, I do think that if you like really amp yourself up for a workout, it will probably be more challenging to recover from, even if you leave the same number of reps in reserve per set. But I also can't pretend like I have any research to cite for that.
Yeah, I know. We're just talking here because the way that I would kind of go about that is to tell whoever it is, it's all still phasic, right? So if you're to not do it every other week would be my suggestion, you know, to scale it. Like go 3 weeks where you're going hard like that, and then 3 weeks where it's the other way. You know, so that way you can control it. Control your controllables, you know, a little bit more, because what I think happens a lot with intermediate and above is maybe every other exercise might be that way, then the other one's that way. Yeah. Right. And then that impacts that next training week, say when it's not that way, it's obviously not as hard. And then they're mentally racked. Yeah. And that now they need to try to find a way to get even more amped up, to now we're starting to deal with recovery demands of just the mental part of being that ramped up all the time, where at what point does that become more of the concern too, now that I just said that? Because now there's a difference between the person that goes, you know, arousal curve top, right? That's obviously going to take more to recover from than slightly down on a arousal curve.
You know, I think most people aren't idiots, and I think most people kind of figure that out for themselves. Like I think when people go from, you know, just finding a program on the internet and saying, I'm going to do this, to taking that first step of let's learn a little bit more about this, generally one of the very first things they'll learn is the importance of progressive overload. And I think when you're introduced to that concept, but your mind is still in a very naive state, and you interpret that as, oh, progressive overload, that just means I have to do more every single week, and that will get me bigger and stronger and everything's great. That tends to work quite well for 3, 4, 5, 6, maybe 12 weeks or whatever. But eventually you find yourself in that state you were just describing, where, you know, it used to be for every lift you're doing, it wasn't that hard to add 5 more pounds, add 1 more rep, but then eventually it is. And you have to cut a corner or have to get a little bit more amped up to get that extra rep or add that extra 5 pounds. And then next week, oh shit, I have to get even more amped up, or like cut corners even a little bit more to add a little more weight or 1 more rep. And I think most people have the experience of going down that road and just running themselves into the ground pretty early in their training career. And even if they don't fully think through why that is, I think that experience kind of sticks with them. And just on an implicit level, they realize, okay, whatever that was, I can't do that again. Not with every exercise, not all the time. And so I think with like a phasic structure of training, that's a good way to minimize risk, so that if someone is pushing that way in a really intense block of training, they can never dig themselves that big of a hole, because that phase might only be 3, 4, 5 weeks, and then they're going to have time to recover. But I think even if someone isn't thinking about things in those terms, if they just have a decent head on their shoulders, that first experience of just running themselves into the ground, I think they take lessons from that.
No, I would agree with that.